It seemed to me that I suddenly precipitated into a terrible, fantastical world. It was as if I was dreaming. The jagged peaks, the huge rock faces that plunged down above our heads, acquired, under the silvery light of the moon, a vague aspect, immaterial, pallid spectres, rigid and frozen, as if they were held under the oppressing influence of a magic spell. The very power of it irresistibly penetrated my mind and spirit with a sentiment of awe and fear, which in vain I tried to free myself of.
I've been dreaming about this journey for over 50 years. My uncle talked about Patagonia and the Tierra del Fuego every time he returned to Italy. My imagination fled towards that unexplored world, that chaos of craggy rocks and peaks. Finally, I'm here, in the land which my uncle loved so much. He dedicated his entire life to it. By the way, my uncle was Alberto Maria De Agostini. These things are part of his story, and also mine. It's incredible. My uncle kept this letter amongst his most important documents. I wrote it to him when I was just 14 years old, on the anniversary of his 50 years in priesthood. It was such a long time ago. The sacred priestly robes you wear, which we all proudly venerate, appear to my young eyes not only as a uniform of faith, but also those of a courageous pioneer who stands out among the splendor of clear, pure glaciers.
There's also a bit of Italy at the end of the world, and it was De Agostini at the time, Father Alberto Maria, who left his traces. Alberto Maria De Agostini was a Salesian missionary, mountaineer, photographer, documentary maker, writer, naturalist, and cartographer. He lived in Patagonia and the Tierra del Fuego for almost half a century, beginning his missionary and exploratory adventures in 1910. The Andes were for him not simply a place but an invitation, and so to the Andes he travelled. He ended his long journey in Tierra, where he died in 1960. It was also his homeland that inspired his passion for nature and the desire to go out and explore it. De Agostini was born in Polone, near to Biella, northern Italy, in 1883. In the family environment, he cultivated his love for maps and geographical discoveries. His brother Giovanni, who founded the biggest Italian geographical institute, had published a cartographic study of the Tierra del Fuego. Maybe this influenced his decision to head for the extreme south of the Americas.
En una tierra que ha llamado habitualmente, desde siglos, el interés de la ciencia, del conocimiento geográfico, la figura de Agostini tiene una relevancia especial. Yo lo he calificado a él en mis trabajos históricos como el último de los grandes exploradores de la Patagonia y la Tierra del Fuego.
De Agostini descubrió lugares geográficos que ni el gobierno chileno ni el gobierno argentino conocían. Es decir, quien conoce más la zona en el tiempo de Agostini es de Agostini.
Diceva che lui non le piaceva fare scuola, le piaceva stare fuori, all'aria libera, a lui le piacevano le montagne.
Para sacar la fotografía de las Torres del Paine, estuvo 15 días, solo allí, bajo carpa, esperando el momento oportuno.
The immaculate peaks, under the bland caress of the sun, have a docile and candid expression that enchants, an aspect of a mild, serene virgin, unaware of passion, because fatal destiny has condemned her to live afar. In the solitude of the Antarctic, perennially whipped by the wind and storms.
The Matterhorn was De Agostini's favourite mountain in Italy. The charm of this mountain, which is higher than 4,000 metres, had captured his interest when he was still a child. In fact, he visited it many times, not just to admire its peak, but to practice his photography. Italy, however, was obviously too small a horizon for him. The experience he acquired on the Alps, he applied during the course of his many journeys, and in particular in the task he spent 40 years tackling, reaching the peak of the Andes Matterhorn, the ice giant.
Sketched for an instant was the gigantic pyramidal profile of Mount Sarmiento, wrapped in the mysterious half-light, looking like a white ghost who had magically appeared to attract spectators. It had such a real appearance of mysterious greatness that it seemed held by the spell of a superior power, the abode of fairies and witches.
De Agostini tried 3 times to climb Mount Sarmiento in 1913, 1916 and in 1953, but failed due to the extreme difficulties posed by the ice wrapped around the mountain. Only in 1956 did Carlo Mauri and Clemente Maffei manage to reach the peak in an expedition coordinated by Father Alberto. After them, no one has ever managed to touch the eastern peak of the southern crest. The climb up Mount Sarmiento was the greatest dream come true of Alberto Maria De Agostini.
Negli anni 50 l'alpinista italiano che arrivava dal Trentino, come mio padre, che partiva per andare in nave in Sud America e poi giù fino in Terra del Fuoco, era veramente qualcosa di quasi impensabile.
E Clemente e Carlo Mauri ce l'hanno fatta, con grandi ringraziamenti da parte del capo spedizione Maria Alberto De Agostini, perché anche per lui è stata una grande vittoria, dopo tanti anni che era là, che lo studiaba.
Él es la expresión de la amplitud cultural de una congregación que no solo se dedica a la evangelización, no solo se dedica a la formación de la juventud, sino que también a la preservación, a la valorización de la ciencia y a la preservación de la cultura. Este es el rol, desde mi punto de vista, especial que cumple Alberto de Agostini a partir de su llegada a Magallanes hace 100 años.
Recently in Chile, a banknote has been produced picturing the Alberto de Agostini National Park, designated in 2005 by UNESCO as a biosphere reserve. The park, Chile's third largest, covers 14,600 square kilometers and includes the islands towards the south of Gabriel Ford and the Admiralty's Channel, as well as numerous other fjords and glaciers. In this area, De Agostini, accompanied only by a person of mixed race, carried out most of his explorations in the territories inhabited by indigenous peoples. They were the only bearers of knowledge of these unexplored regions. Today, there are no native populations left. Their island is home to wild animals alone.
Específicamente respecto del padre Alberto de Agostini, nos interesó mucho la labor de exploración, la rigurosidad científica con que realizó el trabajo de exploración, todo el conocimiento nuevo que generó.
Father De Agostini's homeland provided an important source of inspiration when he first began to experiment with the world of images. This documentary, filmed in 1933 during the annual procession from Fontainebleau in the Aosta Valley to the Europa Sanctuary, represents a significant moment in his research for depth of shot. One of the most innovative choices introduced by Father De Agostini is the continual search for action to represent visually. He didn't limit himself to producing portraits of the indigenous peoples of the Tierra del Fuego, as was usual during the era of colonial photography, but he captured them in their environment, carrying out everyday activities. His images constitute a precious archive of a long-lost world. Even in the most remote regions, he developed innovative techniques, which he managed to express with an original and refined style. The posters he created to announce the projections of his films are classic examples. It was Magellano who chose the name Tierra del Fuego for this region. He was amazed by the vast quantity of campfires he could see along the coast. A square in Punta Arenas is dedicated to the explorer, which continues to be the city's beating heart. But since De Agostini's times, its profile has radically changed. From an ancient penal colony, it has become a commercial center, a landing place for ships crossing the Strait of Magellan. The capital of the Chilean Patagonia towards the end of the 1800s was transformed yet again with the arrival of the first flocks of sheep from the nearby Malvina or Falkland Islands. In fact, from 1884 onwards, the governor authorized the purchase of 300 purebred livestock. This gave rise to the estancias, enormous farms that bred and sold livestock. The experiment was so successful that by the end of the century, almost 2 million farm animals were grazing in the region. The development of the estancias has never really stopped. In fact, they still constitute the supporting pillar of the local economy. This is the Maria Betey Estancia, the biggest sheep shearing station in the world. With the growth of the estancias, Punta Arenas has become the shop window for the big landowners in the region. This is the palace dedicated to Sarah Braun, a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Prussia, who married the Portuguese José Nogueira at the end of the 1800s, owner of 2/3 of the Tierra del Fuego. Today this palace is the center of an exclusive club, Club de la Unión. Cradled on the western side of the Strait of Magellan, Punta Arenas today is still the only big city within the heart of the desolate pampas. This is the old quay where passengers would disembark until the middle of the last century, when the city was home to the biggest and most efficient port within the radius of thousands of kilometers. Today, with its 113,000 inhabitants, Punta Arenas still sees the arrival of numerous immigrants from the four corners of the globe. Among them, someone has left his mark.
Seeing for the first time in my life the city where my uncle disembarked after a long crossing was an emotional experience. But I was more interested in the nature that he loved so much.
This is the Torres del Paine National Park. The 3 towers of the Paine are the most spectacular in the Chilean Patagonia.
How many times my uncle had described the Strait of Magellan to me, battered by the winds and crossed by currents. And here is the Chimpampa, as they call it here, the pampas of silence. Kilometers and kilometers of nothing, just greenery and nature, occasionally marked by a pueblo, a small village. At the beginning of the last century, when my uncle was here, the only people who had ventured into these desolate places apart from him were the indigenous people and the livestock breeders.
Due to the law of modern civilization that prevails, which only upholds the rights of the strongest, the indigenous peoples were soon forced to give up their land to the new conquerors and abandon their native territory forever.
Introducing sheep to this region, the colonists compromised the entire ecosystem. To make room for livestock, local species were exterminated, both predators like the puma and prey such as the guanaco. The indigenous people no longer had game to hunt or animal skins to clothe themselves. So they began to hunt the white guanaco, the sheep. The livestock rearers' reaction was extremely violent. They didn't hesitate in killing off the indigenous people to save their livestock. Gold and whale hunters joined in with the extermination of the indigenous populations too. When they were first contacted, it's assumed that there were between 5,000 and 10,000 indigenous people distributed over a vast territory. In southern Patagonia, there were the Tehuelche, hunters like the Ona, who lived on the great island of the Tierra del Fuego. There were also seafaring tribes, the Cahuesca and the Yamana, nomadic fishermen who lived on the islands of the Gulf of Pena and Cape Horn.
Ya De Agostini percibió de que este mundo indígena estaba colapsado, estaba desapareciendo.
En el caso de Tierra del Fuego, que el proceso de extinción de los indígenas fue mucho más violento y rápido, es desde 1884 hasta 1900-1905 el momento más de mayor intensidad.
Es la sola presencia de la gente civilizada con sus enfermedades introduce un factor que rompe para siempre la armonía, el equilibrio en que estos pueblos vivían desde tiempo inmemorial.
Las causas son diversas, digamos. Podría llamársele capitalismo, podría llamársele codicia, pero todo esto son procesos que ocurrió también en Sudáfrica, ocurrió también en Australia. O sea, es la llegada de la expansión del capitalismo que en Europa ya sobraba hacia regiones que todavía no estaban colonizadas.
Explorers, estancieros, and the military had no scruples in emptying their rifles into the bodies of the poor indios, as if they were beasts or game. And dragging women and girls from their husbands' and fathers' sides to subject them to all sorts of abuse. Taking them away from their home fires to carry them off to foreign lands in the name of science, exhibiting these poor natives to the public as the most degraded beings of humankind.
In Europe, actual colonial exhibitions were organized. Reenactments of the conquered exotic worlds, showing the wild nature of native peoples, whom the white man aimed to civilize. In these shows, Men, women, and indigenous children were displayed, as if they were museum exhibits or laboratory animals.
Gli indigeni della Terra del Fuoco, che si dedicavano alla pesca e alla raccolta di molluschi, spesso seppellivano i loro defunti in grotte naturali e in foreste nelle isole. Questa è una di quelle, l'isola Caruquinca.
Caruquinca is the name of the Ona people used for the Tierra del Fuego. It literally means the last land of the people, the most austral and extreme.
Nel 2010 qui è stato celebrato un rito funebre eccezionale per dare sepoltura alle ossa di 5 indigeni della Terra del Fuoco che erano stati catturati nel 1881 per essere portati in Europa ed esibiti in giardini zoologici.
11 indigenous people were deported to the west, but only 4 returned home. The others died during the crossing, or they fell victim to the diseases caught from the white man.
Questa è l'ultima dimora di quegli indigeni, che finalmente dopo più di 100 anni sono ritornati alla loro terra. E qui sono sepolte le loro ossa all'interno di una cesta, dentro questa che ricorda una capanna tipica, insieme con alcuni oggetti tradizionali.
Right from the start of his mission, Father Alberto Maria De Agostini made contact with the local reality. That's why his story is so closely linked with the populations with whom he lived in the Tierra del Fuego.
My uncle spent hours with the indigenous people, listening to their stories. And now I have the same opportunity. I feel even closer to him. Felicia and Martin told me that the navigator Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa in 1584 founded the first Spanish colony, which he called Rey Felipe, in honor of King Philip II. This area, however, was remembered as the Port of Hunger, after the tragic destiny of the colonists who lived there. On the beach you can still see the remains of native encampments. On these holes, in fact, they built their huts, which were destroyed by the colonists.
Bueno, prácticamente era territorio de indígenas, considerando que el fuerte era un peligro para ellos.
Fort Bulnes symbolized Chilean sovereignty over the Strait of Magellan. The Spanish conquered this outpost only 24 hours before a French expedition. For many indigenous people, this fort has come to symbolize the resistance of local culture, which despite everything has survived colonial presence. This is why Felicia and Martin wanted to take Giovanni to visit such an historically important monument.
Bueno, ser indígena ha sido una parte muy difícil para mí, en mi caso.
Sí, hay varias cosas que me molestan realmente en en la actualidad.
Existe discriminación de ciertas personas hacia nosotros.
No se puede navegar libremente como se hacía tiempos atrás.
Entonces ahí recién se promulgó la ley indígena, en la cual nosotros tenemos derecho a varias cosas, son para la educación, programas de salud, programas de vivienda.
Lo que más me gustaría a mí es poder mostrar a mis nietos cómo se navegaba, cómo se andaba, cómo se hacían los fuegos, cómo se hacían los campamentos, todas esas cosas me gustaría mostrarlo, pero no se puede.
The canoes, called anan, were considered to be the most elaborate and precious crafted works of the native Yamana, because their very survival depended on them. It took about 6 months to build one canoe, working on tree bark. These small, handcrafted works are the only remaining evidence of that centuries-long tradition. This is how Martin, Felicia, and other mixed-race people earn their living.
Hasta hace años atrás, los niños que llegaban hablando en idiomas indígenas en el resto del país, a las escuelas, eran obligados a lavarse la boca con jabón. Por ejemplo, aquellas personas que tenían ciertos rasgos fenotípicos, ciertos rasgos corporales, o ciertos acentos producto del aprendizaje de una primera lengua indígena, ciertamente tenían barreras para acceder a ciertas oportunidades. Hoy día las manifestaciones de discriminación se presentan de otras formas.
The monument of the little Indios in the Punta Arenas cemetery symbolizes a new way of looking at the past. The indigenous people, who were almost invisible for centuries, are regaining their identity.
Lo que hay, yo creo que más que una forma, más que un patrimonio cultural indígena que puede quedar en los museos o puede ser objeto de documentales, es más bien, son formas de vida que tienen que ver con lo que es la Patagonia o la Tierra del Fuego como espacio ambiental, que es un tipo de clima, un tipo de geografía que hace que la vida tenga tendencia a ser más o menos nómade.
When my uncle told me about his adventures in these magnificent places, he often proposed ways in which we could go to enjoy the beauty of this adopted land. Well, now I'm here, all I have to do is follow his instructions.
Time seems to have come to a standstill in the Salesian mission of Our Lady of the Candelaria, or so it seems at first sight. This mission welcomed the young Father De Agostini when he first arrived in the Tierra del Fuego at the age of 27. Founded in 1897, it has been declared a national monument. Displayed within the museum inside the mission are various exhibits of the original culture of the Tierra del Fuego. This is in fact one of the 2 missions where indigenous peoples were welcomed as they fled from the colonists.
To fully understand the attraction of that primitive nomadic life, you need to be confined within the solitude of these valleys, to have scoured these mysterious forests, where hidden from the civilized profane eye, the remains of this race ask for nothing more than to be left alone in its slow, agonizing demise. These were my impressions when in my missionary life I often had the chance to stay and live with these indigenous people.
It must have been in that area in which the native people had their encampment. There's absolutely nothing left. Nothing. My uncle did so much for them. How many times he told me that right here, his bishop, Monsignor Fagnano, encouraged him to dedicate himself to these people. Not being able to save the Indios must have been their greatest source of anxiety.
Los hermanos que permanecían en forma estable, que trabajaban en forma estable en las parroquias, en los colegios, demandaban tanto de Fagnano como de Agostini más permanencia y trabajo en la obra local. De Agostini y Fagnano decían que su trabajo estaba más bien fuera de la comunidad. Y eso traía una cierta tensión que se hizo llegar a las autoridades de la época de Turín, y las autoridades de Turín entendieron cuál era la misión de ellos y, ¿no es cierto?, de forma ecuánime, dieron una respuesta que, bueno, había que permitir que cada uno hiciera el trabajo que tenía que hacer.
The work of Monsignor Fagnano in his defense of the indigenous people has become part of local history. So much so that his figure was the only element that Argentina and Chile could agree upon when choosing a name for this enormous lake on the border of the two countries. Today, it is still known as Fagnano Lake. After the death of Monsignor Fagnano, De Agostini spent 2 years in the city of Puerto Natales. In this period, he limited his excursions in order to dedicate himself to the Christian and pastoral community. In his memoirs, he remembers these 2 years with particular fondness, consecrated above all to the administration of the sacraments. The mission for Father De Agostini was the best way to conciliate his religious vocation with his knowledge of nature, with which he always had a close relationship.
All of nature's elements seemed as if they combined in that remote angle of creation to enchant and terrify.
My uncle was captured by the aura of mystery that enveloped nature in this region, as if he wanted to protect himself within the impenetrable and the only apparent desolate landscape. Yet Darwin baptized this place as an accursed land.
Just a single glance at that place, said the naturalist Darwin, would be sufficient for he who is not accustomed to the sea to dream for 8 days of shipwreck, danger, and death.
El gran sueño que tuvo Don Bosco sobre esta tierra es que la vio rica en petróleo, en carbón y en cosas naturales, que nadie creía. Y cuando llegaron los salesianos no apostaban por esta tierra. Sin embargo, De Agostini con Fagnano se empecinaron que esta tierra bendecía por Dios. Yo creo que en ese sentido, esta cosa que hizo Darwin nos hizo un tremendo bien para la obra de Agostini.
Today in the Tierra del Fuego, many plants for the extraction and use of natural gas, petrol and other raw materials are fully active. This is one of the reasons that this region, which was practically uninhabited a few centuries ago, has been transformed into a land of immigration and today is home to different foreign communities. Father De Agostini took particular care of the Italian community.
Come noi appena arrivati eravamo un po' tristi, non volevamo rimanere, piangevamo e lui ci tirava su. Mi ricordo che mi prendeva in braccio e diceva no non fare più così.
The love Father De Agostini had for the extreme south of Latin America led him to write the first tourist guide.
Describe la distinta naturaleza exorbitante de esta Patagonia, que él se enamoró. Y el amor justamente es una función por la cual uno quiere que otro también participe de ese amor.
This is the Estancia Harborton, an agricultural company founded in 1886, which has become one of the main tourist attractions of the area. Here, the first estanciero of Argentinian Patagonia lived, an Anglican missionary called Thomas Bridges. Bridges also housed many indigenous people fleeing from persecution. He was the only one, together with the Salesians, to take care of them. Today, as witness to his dedication, only the holes where the indigenous people have their huts remain.
It's a curious and funny sight to observe the legions of penguins lined up in order of battle, looking rather grotesque and stupid, moving forward simultaneously, their heads nodding from one side to the other as if they were caricature soldiers.
Well, luckily they haven't changed. They're just the same as my uncle described them all that time ago. Unfortunately, there aren't so many of them. My uncle told me that you couldn't get onto lots of rocks because of the huge number of penguins. And the layer of bird excrement which covered the ground, making the rocks incredibly slippy. Today, to observe penguins, you have to come to the most remote areas or visit small islands like this one, Offing.
Ushuaia, the world's end. This is the most southerly city on the planet. Created as a penal colony, today it has become the region's most important tourist location. The first peak De Agostini climbed up in the Tierra del Fuego lies behind Ushuaia. It's Mount Olivia. Father Alberto and the guides Abeli and Agostini Pession followed this itinerary to reach the top. It was the 1st of March, 1913.
Everything has changed here. Mount Olivia is always there though. Today, as yesterday, it towers over Ushuaia. You never forget your first climb. For my uncle, reaching the peak was not a conquest, but a consciousness-raising experience. He was interested in all that he could discover along the climb.
The novelty of the places, the diversity of life, and especially the charm of the unknown, are the powerful springs that multiply our forces and drive us serenely towards difficulty and fatigue, which we do not ignore.
Let's leave Punta Arenas and head towards the peak which more than any other enchanted my uncle, Mount Sarmiento.
The Strait of Magellan protects the ships from the ocean currents, but even in this channel, waves can reach several meters high. When the sun peeps out, marine mammals spend hours warming themselves out of the sea water.
Along the way, our boat is intercepted and followed by diverse shoals of splendid dolphins, playing on the crest of the waves.
The first mission to welcome the indigenous tribes was built on Dawson Island. Today, it's a Chilean military marine base. The memory of the Salesian presence is still alive, but that's not all. In fact, the sailors, civilian and military, hold De Agostini's research in high regard.
Bueno, francamente, observando la carta, encuentro notable, encuentro extraordinaria la precisión que Alberto De Agostini fue capaz de darle a la configuración de esta costa, considerando que en la época en que él hace estos levantamientos, especialmente en este sector, el sector de los archipiélagos que dan al Océano Pacífico, no existían los apoyos técnicos satelitales que existen en la actualidad.
The indigenous peoples considered this to be the land of abundance because the forest flourishes alongside the glaciers, those snowy white peaks that plunge down towards the sea. And the mountains. They're not very high. They go from 1,000 to 2,000 meters, yet they appear so majestic to those who observe them. De Agostini never missed a chance to highlight the magical quality of these locations.
Never. As in those sublime hours of contemplation known to every human being, in the mysterious solitude of the wilderness and mountains, faced with the superb spectacle of creation, had I ever felt the language of nature talk to me with such a delicate accent and arouse in me such a living, deep emotion.
Leopard seals are vigorous predators and are quick movers in the water. These marine mammals are resting after hunting or a long journey. In fact, they live in the Antarctica, 1,000 kilometers further south, and it's quite rare to see them in the Tierra del Fuego. Maybe they've come here looking for prey. But this is certainly one of the few places in the region where they can rest, thanks to the icebergs on which they love to nap.
Yes, the glaciers. My uncle told me that when he heard a piece of ice break off from the glacier face, the sound was almost sacred.
As well as being imposing, these glaciers are spectacular due to the variety of colours they reflect. From different shades of white to an intense blue colour. Global warming, however, is progressively eroding them. Only 4 remain stable against the 42 that are gradually shrinking. In Patagonia, this process takes place more rapidly than in any other part of the world. Once ice covered vast expanses of sea. It was De Agostini who verified that this water basin was a fjord and not a lake by discovering seawater under the layer of ice and realizing it was connected to the Magdalene Channel. Since then, the fjord has bore his name.
How many times my uncle told me about this high rock, halfway along the De Agostini fjord. He used to put up his tent behind that stone. Who knows what went through his mind as he camped out here alone in the middle of nowhere? The view from here is magnificent. But we mustn't waste time. I started looking for an object, a small box, a stake, or anything that would confirm my uncle had passed through here. But I found nothing.
In fact, the aim of this boat journey is another: to reach the Ice Sphinx.
Here it is. Here is the peak my uncle loved more than any other. He talked about it so much. I imagined this mountain. I gazed upon it in his photographs and dreamt. I dreamt of a day in which I could actually see it for myself. And now, faced with this immense ice pyramid, I think about my uncle, the other mountaineers and guides who challenged death together. To be able to step on the mountain peak right up there. I often ask myself if they were heroes or completely crazy. Now that I'm here, in front of this natural work of art, I don't need to ask that question anymore. This peak has enchanted me too. I understand their passion, the challenge which they couldn't resist.
Magical peak, superb sovereign of ice, which has held us subjugated for a month, attracted by her forms, gripped by the charm of her majestic beauty. It seemed as if we had reached the impalpable regions of the ethereal, where earthly things end and every human aspiration disappears.